Welcome to the Zenergy Podcast. I'm Karan Takhar, and today I speak with Jamila Yamani, Director of Climate and Energy at Salesforce. We explore AI's role in sustainability, Salesforce's approach to emissions reduction, and their engagement with suppliers. Jamila also shares career advice for young professionals. Hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, Jamila. Thank you so much for joining the podcast. It is a privilege to have you on and appreciate you taking the time. I'm really looking forward to diving into your journey and your impactful work at Salesforce. Before getting into the specifics, I'd love to kick off this conversation by learning about what inspired you to pursue climate and sustainability work. And I saw that you have a chemical engineering background from what some may say are the most academically rigorous schools, MIT and Yale. And so I'd love to hear how your engineering background has shaped your career.
Totally, Karan. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me and allowing me to share a little bit about my path and the work that I do today. So like many folks, when I graduated, 2008, the market was tanking. It was tough to get a job at that time. Thought about all the different ways I could maybe expand, get a little deeper on a number of different topics. I got my master's during that time. And during my master's, I spent time at NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab, doing work on biofuels. And that was kind of the first foray that I had into what was a version of sustainability, at least as I knew it then. And, my eyes started opening to the challenges that we faced around carbon, around energy, and the different solutions that we were developing. Once I finished my master's, I knew there was a little more I had to learn. I got my doctorate in chemical and environmental engineering, and I was really fortunate that the program that I was a part of was chemical and environmental engineering. And I think it expanded a lot of the views that I had, because it wasn't just a very strictly chemical engineering background. At that time, chemical engineering really meant petroleum engineering. And I think it was a different perspective that program brought for me. And I did my work on sustainable wastewater remediation at that time. But more importantly, it started opening my eyes to the interconnecting challenges that we faced between water, energy, waste, air, materials. None of the challenges exist on their own, and none of the solutions can address only one pillar. We can never try to solve one problem at the cost of another. And that understanding of these interconnected challenges, I think, is really what brought me to climate. When I was finished with my doctorate, I spent time in private equity and then venture capital, focusing primarily on industrial decarbonization and the energy transition, thinking about energy solutions across the spectrum, all the way from power to hydrogen to ammonia, alternative uses of natural gas, really trying to understand monetization of the energy value chain and how does that align with an energy transition in a low carbon future. I moved to Salesforce in 2021, working on climate and energy. Definitely dream job, get to think about what systems change means for a corporate footprint and the role of a corporate buyer like Salesforce in advancing systems change across nature, climate, energy, AI today, data. And I really want to set the stage a little bit for Salesforce in particular, what we do at Salesforce, because sustainability has been a really big part of Salesforce's journey for over a decade. And we established sustainability as a core company value a few years ago, and it's really fundamental to the business and how we serve our stakeholders. Especially in this moment where AI is top of mind, developing an equitable and sustainable AI strategy is definitely top of mind. And there are three main ways that kind of shows up for us. Making AI more sustainable through technology, accelerating climate innovation through new AI investments, and of course, driving social equity with AI. And now Salesforce is really focused on Agentforce, which is a new layer on the platform, really driving AI at scale through deploying AI agents. And some of the main ways that this kind of connects back to our sustainability journey, and the things that I think I really want to highlight are, we bring sustainability to the core of all the work that we do. And so, for example, in Agentforce, we use a distributed intelligence approach. We rely on smaller, specialized models for specific tasks, whether it's something like automating support or generating sales insights across the board. And this makes it more efficient, more sustainable, and more accurate. And we also use the same technology, Agentforce, to drive our own innovation and sustainability, which I think will be a really nice segue into the work that we're doing on our team today. Our sustainability team created an emissions intelligence agent that makes these sustainability insights, whether it's historical emissions, climate targets, energy consumption, all autonomously surfaced using an agent through natural language. So I think we're trying to find that space between where AI and sustainability intersect, and not just the downsides, which is something that we often focus on in our world, but also how we can leverage AI to advance our sustainability goals.
Wow, I think we could end the interview right there.
Did
That
run
was
off a bit. I'm
incredible.
sorry.
There's a lot to dive into. And I appreciate you expanding on your journey as well as some of the work that Salesforce is conducting, and really like the framing Agentforce. That's a whoever came up with that is creative, and gonna park that for a second, but super excited to learn more about Agentforce. Before getting to that, you were mentioning how in your graduate and postdoctoral academic journey, one of the main insights slash educational benefits was developing that interdisciplinary outlook, which has then helped shape you. And what struck me as I was doing research for this conversation is you've had experience in many different areas, from VC and PE, as you mentioned, to now working at a corporate. I'd love to get a sense of whether there were any specific courses and technical insights through your degrees that you feel have helped shape your ability to tackle climate from a more informed level, for those listeners who, might be thinking about diving into some more educational classes to better equip themselves in the field.
When I first started working in climate, I used to think climate was a science problem. And I thought that us solving climate change we're going to science our way to the answer. And over time, I've learned that's in fact not the case. Sure, scientists like myself, engineers have a role to play, but there are so many other important factors in us being able to deliver on our climate goals, whether you're coming at it from a policy perspective, influencing public opinion, disclosures in a very regulatory space. There are so many different approaches. For me specifically, and I've spent a lot of time in school, and folks have asked me, what is it that I learned there that I still bring with me today? The truth is, the most important thing I've learned is how to answer a question that I don't know the answer to. Climate, every day, we're faced with a new problem that we didn't know yesterday. We are faced with a new perspective that we didn't have yesterday, whether that's going to be the rapid development of AI growth or destruction of mangroves in regions across the world. New challenges are always going to be coming up. We're going to have new impacts of climate change that we're going to have to work around in order to be able to reach our mitigation goals. And so I think the number one thing I've learned in school is where to start. How do you start answering a question that you really know nothing about? I don't think any of us that work in climate today knew what we were getting ourselves into. But I know maybe that's not as helpful as you'd like, but
Super helpful.
Point specific.
Totally agree. It keeps expanding and new areas keep emerging. So where do you start generally when it comes to trying to attack an answer or a problem that you previously don't have a lot of experience in?
Google has been my friend, whether it was in my doctorate or in my undergraduate work. But today, we have tools like ChatGPT and Claude, and they're a great starting point. It lets you know what questions should I be asking. Not necessarily what's the answer to those questions, but it at least starts to take you in a direction where the perspective that you bring or knowledge that you do have starts to intersect with the challenge in front of you. And that's when I think, we really start to understand what is our role in addressing, whatever challenge is in front of us. If you were to ask me about AI, 6 months ago, I would have been at a total loss. What are the intersections with my work? Probably a year ago now. It's been a minute, but over time we've learned what are the primary inputs that go into growing AI. What are some of the primary challenges that we're going to face? Then we really start to see the intersections between whatever your expertise is and the challenge in front of you.
That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it's been really impressive to see how a technology like ChatGPT, for example, has evolved. I was an early adopter of ChatGPT, I must say, because I was in also graduate school and had a really clear use case.
Yeah.
And the evolution since that time, I think, is like August 2022 or October 2022 till now has been incredible. And only can imagine, we're still super early. I was recently listening to an interview conducted by the New York Times of Sam Altman, where he was mentioning, which is why I'm so excited to dive into Agentforce, about how the next step or iteration is going from language models to the agent model in the AI. And that's coming like much sooner than we realize, probably in the next year. So now transitioning to some of the work that Salesforce is doing on that front, could you set the stage for what exactly Agentforce is? And then I'd love to talk about some of the inputs that you just alluded to in terms of where the intersection is climate and the evolution of AI.
Definitely. I think what you heard in that comment by Sam Altman is exactly where Salesforce sees this space going. Agentforce is a new layer that sits on top of the existing Salesforce platform that lets our customers, that lets companies deploy AI agents. It's how companies can do more with less. I think one of the key pieces is around augmenting human abilities. It's not intended to, I think, replace humans, as we often hear as the primary challenge, but really enable companies to enable individuals to autonomously take actions with an agent and enhance operations, increase productivity, and scale the impact within their communities and whatever work that they're doing. I shared a little bit about the inputs, but I don't want to get too far ahead in case there are any other things on Agentforce before we move forward.
What are some examples of agents, just to really make it concrete for the listeners?
For sure. We actually have a couple of public stories that we can share. I can share with you offline around nonprofit customers, since we mainly work in the impact space. College Possible, Good 360. They're using Agentforce to enhance their operations and drive impact, whether it's an agent that can provide information to a student who's applying to college. I mentioned the agent that the sustainability team has built that autonomously surface sustainability insights, like identifying historical emissions or climate targets or energy consumption. So the world is our oyster. I think there are so many possible use cases for Agentforce out there, and many of them are impact and climate focused, and learning more every day.
And that's why you might have one of the best jobs there is out there, because you're literally essentially at the intersection of two incredible trends. Can you tell us about your role as Director of Climate and Energy at Salesforce and what your day-to-day work entails?
I think it would be helpful for me to just share a little bit about the priorities of our team and how my work maybe fits into that. So when we think about our team, we are obviously focused on Salesforce's own emissions footprint and driving that down. However, we know that Salesforce doesn't exist in a silo. We can do everything that we can to reach net zero, but we still sit within a global context. And that's really where our team's work comes in. We're thinking about systems change. How do we drive impact outside of the four walls of Salesforce to help Salesforce meet its goals and the planet meet its goals? That includes things like purchasing of market-based mechanisms, whether that's carbon credits, renewable energy certificates, sustainable aviation fuel certificates, and so on. It also includes policy. It includes working with with industry groups and our peers. And I think we're continuing to innovate on what type of levers do we have to drive change outside of the four walls of Salesforce. But for me, some of the things that I'm working on today include Salesforce's commitment to buy $100 million of durable carbon removal by 2030 and deploying that capital. I'm also thinking a lot about our Scope 3 emissions and how do we decarbonize emissions that actually sit very far away from us? As you can imagine, for a company like Salesforce that sits very far down the value chain, our emissions footprint is largely driven by the emissions that sit in our supply chain, which those are our supply chain emissions. And so, what's really necessary is industrial decarbonization, systems change that really has to happen on a global scale. And so these are some of the primary topics that I'm thinking about, of course, energy as it relates to AI, energy as it shows up in Salesforce's footprint, kind of the core topic, I guess, that we start with.
Definitely plan to ask you a question on the intersection of energy and electricity growth, given all of this AI growth that is coming on to the system. But would love to just double click on your work attempting to drive down Scope 3 emissions. So as you mentioned, can only imagine that must be challenging given that you're essentially working with companies that are way down the supply chain who might not necessarily directly transact with you, but do have an impact on the product through earlier inputs. So in that type of situation, what do those conversations look like with suppliers? And generally, do you find that they're receptive? I'm sure it varies across supplier, but receptive to working with you and the team to driving down their climate impacts, even in cases where it might lead to increased costs? Or does that not necessarily happen where you can drive down the climate impacts at various levels of supply chain while keeping costs stabilized or even lower? I'd love to just hear your perspective on that front.
So, obviously you hit on the core challenge, which is the green premium. How do you drive down the green premium and who pays for that? So I'll mention two ways that we kind of think about supply chain, decarbonizing our supply chain. One is a very bottoms-up approach, supplier by supplier, working directly with our suppliers on their own sustainability goals, since our sustainability goals are also very much reliant on their progress. And we have a team that spends their time working on our supplier sustainability. We also have a sustainability exhibit, which is a contractual relationship that kind of establishes sustainability between a supplier and Salesforce. The other approach is what I call kind of a top-down approach, which is thinking about this from a very industrial decarbonization perspective. And in that model, we're thinking about the commodities that are being traded within our supply chain that are causing emissions. An easy example is aviation and air travel. While those are direct suppliers of Salesforce, if you will, that are emitting, we buy air travel from an airline who combusts fuel within their airplane and emits CO2. In order for that airline to decarbonize and move over to sustainable aviation fuel, which has a lower overall carbon intensity, there's a green premium associated with that. And in many cases, our airline partners want to see that happen, but they can't carry the cost of that green premium alone. And that's really where we start to transact for what we call market-based mechanisms like sustainable aviation fuel certificates, where we buy the scope 3 attributes of that reduction in return for the green premium in order for an airline to onboard sustainable aviation fuel into their fleet. And this is just, I think, one of the first. We've obviously seen this on renewable energy happen at scale. And we're starting to see this extend beyond just sustainable aviation fuel, but to other industries, whether it's concrete or steel or chemicals. And I'd say we're all innovating in this space. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like. Every industry has its own challenges. And I think we know very well what works in one industry is not necessarily going to work in another. But, we're going to keep marching forward and try to find the ways that we can support industrial decarb across all of these different spaces.
What would you say is driving that desire to lower emissions across different areas of the supply chain at Salesforce?
I think there are a couple of different ways to look at it. The first is, of course, public commitments. Salesforce has science-based targets, and in order to meet those science-based targets for decarbonization, we are going to need to decarbonize our supply chain. We cannot reach net zero without our suppliers also reaching net zero. I think that's kind of the first context under which this, the umbrella of work at Salesforce is. In addition, in many cases, what we see as a decarbonized future is a much more resilient future of course, for the planet from a climate perspective, but also for our business. And so when we think about decarbonizing our supply chain, we're not strictly thinking about, what's the fastest way that we reduce our emissions, but also what's the most resilient and sustainable way for us to do that so that the future that we're creating can sustain decreased emissions over time. And so, yes, climate is, of course, at the center, but we also see climate as a material business risk, which I think is also coming across when we look at disclosure requirements happening across Europe and, perhaps eventually across the United States, recognizing that climate is a business risk. And that's why we see things like CSRD, all of the other alphabet soup of disclosure requirements that companies like Salesforce are subject to.
Just one more question on this front, because I think it's really important. So what exactly are the business risks?
At the very highest level, I'll share two. One, we've seen so much data on decreased global GDP as a result of climate change. We know that to be true, and it's not going to exist in a silo. Companies around the world are going to experience the impacts of decreased economic growth, including a company like ours. If we get a little bit more tactical, if we think about the impacts of climate change, such as extreme weather. I mean, I live in Texas. Back in 2021, we had a freak ice storm that took out power to so much of the state, including where I live, for several days. We are the energy capital of the world, and yet still in light of extreme weather that we were unprepared for, we could not deliver power to homes, in a metropolitan part of town. So extend that to like a corporate footprint that whether it's our buildings, whether it's data centers, anything at all, our employees, extreme weather is going to impact all of those, not just for our company, but for companies across the world.
Thank you for expanding on that. Now shifting gears to data centers and how they're impacting electricity growth at the macro level. So of course, Salesforce is one of the leading SaaS companies globally, and also just in general, leading technology provider. So I assume that Salesforce is making significant investment in building out its data center portfolio. Could you speak to how data centers are expected to drive up demand for electricity, and how you think this is going to overlap with climate work at the company?
Sure. I won't speak specifically to Salesforce in this context, but a little bit more broadly in our industry. I'd say in general, um, corporate leaders in sustainability, in particular in our industry, have historically been procuring 100% renewable energy for many years. We've been bringing on new load growth, both in the United States as well as outside of the United States. Salesforce has publicly shared some procurements that we've done in developing economies to demonstrate that it's not just about the megawatt, but it's about where that megawatt is. What are you displacing with that megawatt? And you want to make sure that it's the highest emission electricity that we can replace. But at the stage that we are at today, renewable energy procurement is where it is and necessary. But what's really going to constrain us is grid transmission, like transmission infrastructure, and our ability to deliver power across the country at this scale with the additional load growth. I am hopeful and anticipate us to continue to see more renewable energy brought online, both domestically and around the world, but our grid infrastructure can't support that where it is today. How do we reduce permitting times for interconnect? How do we modernize existing grids to balance loads and generation? And we're working with a number of industry groups, with our peers on exactly these topics, whether it's Emissions First Partnership or Zero Grid, to address some of these topics and understand what is the role of the corporate buyer like Salesforce.
Do you find that in these discussions, given all of the demand growth that is now being projected to come online, which in some ways was sort of an unexpected development in terms of the actual scale and speed at which AI and other technologies like it are coming online, do you find that there are tangible solutions that are coming online in a time horizon that will meet the demand?
I think you're right that the speed of this transition is going to be faster than we anticipated just because of the anticipated load growth. I think we can actually meet growth demands. We've demonstrated several years ago that solar plus storage is more economical than, for example, bringing on new natural gas. We know that to be true. Where I think we're going to get held up is when folks want to bring online new solar, how easy are we going to make that? Are we going to make it as easy as it is to start new natural gas? Are we going to help the permitting process go faster? Are we going to enable interconnect? I think in general, there is agreement that renewable power is the most sustainable and reliable option. So it's not just about the climate impacts, but also about the reliability to the grid, broader impacts, whether we're talking about pollution, of course, climate. But are there solutions? I think the only thing that stands in our way is our will to do it. These are solutions that, there are some industries when we talk about decarbonizing, they're held up by technological innovation. We don't have solutions to decarbonize X challenge. This kind of goes back to where I said earlier that I thought climate was a science problem to be solved. We've actually already solved how to deliver clean power. We know how to generate carbon-free electricity. The challenges that remain for us are much more on the policy side. They are on the deployment side, on how do we make adequate business models around something like this? How do we grow this technology that we know to work at scale? And I think when we start to think about it that way, we realize that it's not a technological hurdle in front of us. It's an ability for us to deploy at scale, which is a different problem. It's a business problem. It's a commercialization problem. It's a policy problem.
That makes so much sense and was really well said. Appreciate you tackling that question. And we really only have a few minutes left, which is crazy in terms of how quickly this conversation has gone by. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Do you have any advice that you would give young professionals interested in bridging technical expertise and leadership in the climate space?
I'm gonna first wrap us on the previous topic, which I think will bring us nicely into my recommendation for folks moving forward, which is, often we focus on the downside risks of of every climate challenge, as we should. We need to be primarily focused on mitigation. But I think as long as we recognize that these challenges exist, we can be optimistic around the benefits of our work, whether it's something like AI or anything else, and hold on to that optimism, because climate work is really, really hard. And there are days when you feel like we're not moving forward fast enough. But, working together, if we lean into the right technology, the right solution, the transparency, collaborating with our peers, we can't lose hope. It's hard work, but there is no future if we don't solve this challenge. And, historically, humankind has been really good at standing up to the challenge in front of us. So that would be my first piece of advice. It's hard, but stick with it. I think this is the most rewarding space to work in. There's not a day that I wish I did something else. This is the work that I know will leave something behind for not just me, but for my children. The other piece of advice for folks that are early in their career is everyone who works in climate at some point knew nothing about climate. And so while I may be on this call today, speaking as an expert in climate and sustainability, I'm still learning too. There's something new in this space every single day. So if it feels insurmountable, don't let it. Just become familiar with the language, familiar with the challenges, and then find what is the niche in this space that makes sense for my skill set. We didn't all know about climate. Like you said earlier, you're still learning too. The space changes so fast. We're all on this journey, but don't let that be a hurdle for you. Just dive right in.
And thankfully, now we have ChatGPT.
There you go. Put in that prompt. Tell me everything I need to know about climate and sustainability in 100 words.
Reflecting on your career, if this is a question I love to ask, and I'm particularly excited to hear your answer to it. If you could go back in time, give one piece of advice to yourself after you graduated undergrad, and then additionally after starting out in VC and private equity post doctoral research, does anything come to mind in those two separate instances?
I've always been afraid to speak up because I thought I had the wrong answer, that I didn't know the right answer. And I think over time I've recognized, and I wish my old self would have known this, just to be in the room is a gift. If you open your mouth and you have a chance to share, or you have a perspective or a learning, bring it to the group. You'll learn something, or somebody else will learn something. There's no downside. And I think that's the part that over time I've come to understand. Even if it's something as simple as sending a message to somebody on LinkedIn, somebody you don't know, like, why hesitate? Beautiful things can happen if people reach out. And the worst thing that can happen is someone will say no. And I wish I would have known this, especially when I graduated college. Cold calls are hard, but LinkedIn makes them much easier. And so I think I would have invested a little bit more time there. And I'd recommend folks early in their career to spend time on LinkedIn. It's a great resource to learn about industries you're interested in, people, network, just, see what's out there.
Very, very powerful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate you joining the podcast. That was a wide-ranging conversation and certainly learned a lot from it. Thanks so much for sharing all of your incredible insights.
Thank you for taking the time with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for checking out the Zenergy Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and subscribe to the podcast. It would mean so much to me and the rest of the team. We release episodes every Thursday, so stay tuned for all new episodes featuring industry leaders building a cleaner, greener future for us all. See you next time.